I'm attempting to record this. Hopefully it works. Okay. Alrighty, so everybody can see me, everybody can hear me, I hope. Great. Well, hello, thank you for joining me today. I'm down in the corner here. I'm Karen Lakis, a naturalist here at Rocky River Nature Center. And I have a co-host, Melissa, and she's also a naturalist here. So if you have questions, you are welcome to type them in the chat, and we'll try to answer them as they come in, or and Melissa will alert me if they do. I'm happy to try to answer them. Sometimes, I'll answer them without, even knowing that you've asked them. But if you do have questions that I don't answer along the way, please feel free to let me know. So we are talking today about Ohio wildlife, past and present. We are not going to go back as far as the end of the Ice Age when we had, mastodons roaming the land or anything like that. We're just going to go back to about the time of settlement when Ohio became a state. So around 1800, when people of European descent started coming from New England to live here in Ohio, and what the landscape may have been like for them, and then how it's changed through the years. So we'll get started here, I hope. Oh boy. All right. Melissa, what's going on? Hold on 1 second, please. Okay, there we go. So, as you can read here, this is a account. Melissa's. All right. In the early times, so as you can read here, Melissa's on my quote, so I can't see the whole thing. In the early times of Cuyahoga County, there were bears, wolves, a few elks, wild turkeys, coons, porcupines, possums, squirrels, wild ducks, wild geese, and pigeons innumerable. They have nearly all left. And this is an account given by a man named Isham Morgan towards the end of his life. So in 1890, he would have written his recollection of what it was like when he first arrived here around 1812. And he's saying that all of these wildlife were here at that time, but now they're pretty much all gone. So this is a trend that certainly happened throughout the 19th century. As people moved into Ohio, the wildlife disappeared in many cases, and in some cases, as one thing disappeared, other things arrived. So we will focus on a few specific species here today. But first, why did things disappear? Well, yeah.
Hey, Karen, just real quick, do you want to pop your video back on, or are you good with it off? I just wanted to make sure.
Oh,
we can't see you right now.
Oh.
You are.
Hi, I'm back. Thank you.
All good.
Because I tried to move it. I moved myself, and then when I moved myself, I disappeared. All right, I'm back. So reasons that animals disappeared, you can see here. Unregulated hunting and trapping. There were no rules for a very long time about how many things you could take and when you could take them. So people just took whatever they wanted. Habitat loss. Ohio was a forest, mainly, most of it, when the first settlers came to live here. And they came here to farm. So as they cut down trees to make farms, a lot of things lost their habitat that had lived here. They lost their trees and their forests that they needed. Introduction of non-native species. So when people arrived, they brought things with them that they knew back in Europe or wherever they lived. And in some cases, those things forced things that lived here out. And we find that with species still today, that non-native species are really a problem, taking away habitat and food and places to live for our native species. And use of chemicals, which we'll talk about, but certainly herbicides and things like that have a great effect on wildlife, some more than others. Two terms you might hear, extinction, which is a species is completely gone. It's nowhere on Earth. It's gone. So, you know, like dinosaurs, like mastodons and mammoths from the Ice Age, gone. And extirpation, which means that it disappears, something disappears from a certain place, but you can still find it somewhere else. So there are a number of animals that were extirpated from Ohio, but still could be found maybe in states around us, just not here. So those are two terms that you will hear. And the images I hope you've taken a look at, you can see the men standing by some of those huge trees that were here early on that they removed to build farms and as progress continued. But they were huge. We were covered with just tremendous woodlands. And you can also see a man here. It looks like he has a bunch of foxes that he hunted or trapped. So you can see that people really place a lot of value in fur. And that makes sense because there wasn't the materials that we have today that we can wear to keep warm. That's what people wore, was fur. So it was very, very valuable and important. But in many cases, you know, the species really suffered because of humans coming in and taking their fur. So we will move on and I don't know why this computer doesn't want to work. So when I pop on the screen, for some reason, I can't advance my slides. So I'm just going to stay off the screen because I'm not sure what's wrong. So black bear. Black bear were extirpated from Ohio by 1850. So it was a very, very common animal prior to European settlement here. And then within about 50 years of people really coming to live here, they were gone. Black bear need those deep woodlands that people were cutting down in order to build farms. Also, black bear, people were afraid of bears. They would shoot them on sight because they thought they would eat their children or eat their chickens or something like that. So black bear certainly took quite a toll as settlement came through Ohio. And you can see I have some stats here from the Ohio Division of Wildlife about black bears because we hear now that they're making a comeback and they are sighted here in Ohio more and more through the years. So we have black bear sightings in Ohio, and you can see I have them up to 2018. They didn't have any data past that, so that's as far as we go. And but you can see there's been, you know, there were quite a few sightings, confirmed and unconfirmed, of black bears in Ohio. And then you can see that mainly they're on the eastern side of the state because most of those bears are coming from Pennsylvania and West Virginia. And usually they're young males who are trying to establish their own territory. And so they are wandering around looking for territory, and they wander in, and generally they can't find particularly good territory here because we just don't have what they need, the habitat that they need. So they wander back out. But they do wander into Ohio quite often up on the eastern part of the state. And here's a photo I love. It was taken by the Kirtland, Ohio Police Department a few years ago. And this bear had come into Kirtland and was laying underneath someone's bird feeder. So they had sightings there quite often. I used to work out in Kirtland, and there would be sightings of bears at people's bird feeders, or people's bird feeders would just be ripped to shreds by bears occasionally, a young male like this, and then he'd stay for a little bit and then he'd be gone. So black bears really aren't settling in Ohio, you know, as they once had been, but they do come here and visit here. So their populations are good in the states around us. Another animal that you may not realize was gone from Ohio for about 100 years is the American beaver. They're so common today that it's hard to believe that we didn't have any beavers in this state for about 100 years. And the main reason for the beavers disappearing is the European fur trade. So starting in the 1500s, as Europeans came across the ocean and met up with American Indian tribes on the East Coast, they would hire those Indians to go into the interior and get them furs, particularly beaver. So the Iroquois from New York were very, very good at trapping beavers, and they had their own methods, but then as Europeans arrived, they gave them metal traps and guns and new methods of doing things. So they became really good at it, really proficient, and they would have moved west from New York to Pennsylvania to Ohio, and they would have just trapped and hunted everything. So they came into the Great Lakes and just decimated the beaver population. And you can read this quote. It says, "The beaver was formerly found in great numbers in this region, but since the Indians have learned from the whites to catch them in steel traps, they are more rarely found." And this was, this was the 1770s. So even before people really came to settle in Ohio, the beavers had mostly disappeared through the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. And yes, we have quite a few beaver lodges here in Cleveland Metro Parks, for sure. We'll talk about that in a sec. So why do people want beaver fur so much? Well, beavers have great fur. So they have 2 layers of fur. They have outer guard hairs, the longer hairs, but if you dig down right next to their skin, they have felt. And this felt is warm and waterproof and soft, and people love to make hats out of it. So in the 1700s and 1800s, beaver felt hats were all the rage over in Europe and also here then in America. And that's what hats were made out of. So that's what they wanted the beavers for, to make their hats. And that is why so many beaver were trapped and why beaver disappeared from Ohio by 1830. So, of course, beaver felt hats eventually fell out of favor. We don't wear those really anymore. And in 1936, another beaver was seen in Ashtabula County. So finally, a sighting is reported 100 years later of a beaver. As you can see, in 1946, there was a dam, and then they decided to do a study, and the studies showed that there were about 100 beavers in Ohio. And 1970, they're in about half the counties, and today we have them in every county, and they are plentiful. In Ohio, they are plentiful in the metro parks for sure. Any of our metro parks you go to, pretty much that have good waterway in them, you will see beaver. Here at Rocky River, we have several families of beavers, and many of the other parks too as well. So they are nature's architects. They build their dams and their lodges, and they are able to totally control their environment. And it's a fascinating animal to watch. And I'm so glad that they're not gone, that they're back today. So those of you of a certain age like me might recognize this family. It's the family from the show called Leave It to Beaver. And that family looks like they are maybe having Thanksgiving dinner. And what are they having for Thanksgiving dinner? Well, turkey. So we see turkeys pretty regularly here in Northeast Ohio. And there are plenty of turkeys here now. But 1904, so about 100 years after we became a state, they were gone from Ohio. Couldn't find one. So basically, it was habitat loss that did it to them. They didn't have their woodlands that they need for nesting, and people hunted them quite a bit. And so in the 1950s, though, turkeys started to come back on their own as the farms started to disappear from Ohio and the fields started to grow up, and these like woodland edges that turkeys like started to grow back up. Turkeys started to come back in. And now we have, they're not rare at all. They're quite abundant. So you can see here, once again, it's the eastern side of the state. that border Pennsylvania, West Virginia, where you're going to find the most turkeys, but you can find them in every county in Ohio. I'm of the opinion that deer are plentier in this country than horned cattle are in New England. However, this state of things will not last long, for whenever a country begins to be settled, the native inhabitants must either flee or perish outright. John May in Marietta, Ohio, 1788. So deer are plentiful. However, people are coming in and settling and things are disappearing. So that's what he's saying here. And he's saying that the deer are going to disappear. And in fact, they did. So hard to believe today because we see deer so much. There are so many. But in 1904, deer were actually extirpated from Ohio. So there were no deer here 1904 for quite a number of years after that. So our deer are Virginia deer. That's their scientific name. So the Virginia deer is rarely met with in Ohio at present, except as domesticated in parts. And that was 1882. So by 1882, it was very difficult to find a deer here in Ohio. 1904, they were gone. In fact, in 1882, the Cleveland Zoo started. It was down at Wade Oval, University Circle area. And the first animals at the Cleveland Zoo were 14 white-tailed deer. And those were donated by a man named Jephthah Wade. And they lived in a deer barn that was constructed at Wade Oval. And that deer barn actually is at the zoo, our Cleveland Metro Park Zoo today. It's where you buy ice cream when you go to the zoo, by the waterfowl pond there. But can you imagine the first animals in the zoo that people went to see were white-tailed deer because they were uncommon. So in the 1930s, the Division of Wildlife began to release deer. The deer began to return on their own from surrounding areas. And as you can see, deer are doing just fine today. Approximately 725,000 deer in our state. Last year's deer harvest, last few years, they took about 180,000 deer each season for hunting. So we have plenty of deer and they're doing well. And so the hunters, are able to take lots of deer each year, which is good because it helps to control the population. And deer was named our Ohio state animal back in 1988. So here's some of our other state animals if you don't know them. We have a state amphibian now, that's the toad. And we have a state drink. Anybody know what it is? No, beer's a good guess though. It's tomato juice. Not sure why actually, but it is. All right, so moving on. I know. Yes, tomato juice. All righty. So one time we had elk here. They weren't here very long after settlement. They didn't make it very long. Elk need a lot of space. And they were in areas that were not forested, that were more like prairie and open areas. But they did have elk here. And you can see that the Muskingum River comes from a word meaning elk's eye because of the number of elk that were near it. So they were here. You can't really find them here anymore. You got to go out west. But if you go out to Yellowstone, National Park or Rocky Mountain, you'll see them everywhere. So they're very, very common out west. There's more room for them there. Timberwolves were here, extirpated also very quickly after settlement by 1842. And wolves were scary. People came here to farm and to have farm animals, and wolves would eat them. They'd eat the sheep and the chickens and things. So they actually put bounties of up to $5 for a wolf skin in Ohio because they wanted these wolves gone, people who had livestock. So they were common and slowly dwindled away until extirpated in 1842. They were pretty much all hunted out of here. And coyotes were not here. Coyotes are not native to Ohio. Coyotes came after the wolves left. So the coyotes are native to the west, and they slowly moved east in the 1800s. And so we started seeing coyotes in Ohio about 1900. And so now those obviously are very plentiful. You can see the map there. The distribution is high. And Cuyahoga County has a really high population, as well as Columbus, Cincinnati, Dayton, areas that are urban actually really do fine with, coyotes do fine with that. They're very, very adaptable to urban environments. So they, there's plenty of them around here in Cuyahoga County. Red foxes were something that were not commonly seen prior to settlement. Instead, a gray fox would have been a more common fox to see because gray foxes climb trees and live in trees. So when we had lots and lots of big trees here in Ohio, we would have had more gray foxes. And then once the trees were gone, they were cut down for farming, more red foxes were here. And today we still have far more red foxes than gray foxes. Gray foxes are hard to find, very elusive. Personally, I've never seen one in the wild. I'd love to, but I never have. So maybe someday. Got to look up at a tree though. So there's a legend in this area, and because Hinckley Reservation is one of our parks, I thought I'd bring it up that the Great Hinckley Hunt, December 24th, 1818, is a good example of the wildlife that lived here. And this is true. So they all came together December 24th, made a perimeter around Hinckley, and then all started moving inward. And when they got to a certain point, they started shooting everything they saw. And at the end of the day, and they took an inventory, and they'd killed 21 bears, 17 wolves, 300 deer, and untold numbers of turkeys, foxes, and raccoons. So in Hinckley, there was just so much wildlife, and they needed to get rid of some of it because they wanted to take out some of these large predators, particularly bears and wolves. So they organized this hunt, and people came from all over and participated. And so they took what they wanted, but left carcasses behind. So the legend is that in the spring, when everything thawed, all these decaying carcasses thawed, is when the vultures started to come to Hinckley to feed on those carcasses. And now we know that every year it's a big deal when the vultures return to Hinckley. And turkey vultures don't migrate quite like they used to. We see them a lot earlier now, and we see them, some of them overwintering here now, but in the past they did not do that. They would all migrate and return in the spring. So Great Hinckley Hunt, it's really telling of how much wildlife was here at one time. We had bison here in Ohio at one time. They were gone, right after settlement. Bison have very specific needs of space, and I'm sure humans did not leave them that space that they needed, probably, with settlement and people moving in, and so they were gone pretty quickly from Ohio. But here's a quote from 1751 that Christopher Gist said there were 40 or 50 buffaloes feeding by the Little Miami River. So these quotes are invaluable for us to know what was here. Without them, we would have no idea, how many animals were here. But these little tidbits from the writings of settlers and explorers are so, so helpful in knowing what was living here back at that time, because we just, there's not a lot of evidence. So something like that really helps. So bison in North America. So 1803, the last bison was recorded in Ohio. 1804, they're considered extirpated. By 1820, they're gone from east of the Mississippi River. So any bison that had lived here, were gone. And slowly but surely, the bison, to the west also have disappeared throughout the 19th century. With the Indian removal, they would remove the bison in order to get the Native Americans to move on. So there are just small pockets of bison left. Most are are privately owned bison. There are conservation herds, though, particularly large ones at Custer State Park in um, South Dakota, and also Yellowstone in Wyoming. So if you want to see bison, go out there. I was in Custer State Park last summer, and huge herds of bison. They're all over, so it was really cool to see. All right, so here is an extinct animal. So this is an animal that has gone extinct since settlement of Ohio, and it's fascinating to me because a lot of people have never even heard of a passenger pigeon. Look kind of like a dove, but different coloring, kind of like a mourning dove, but different coloring. But they were once the most abundant bird in North America. So when people came here to settle in 1803, this would have been 25 to 40% of the total population of birds in the United States. There were about 3 to 5 billion of these flying around. And a little over 100 years, they were completely gone and extinct. Totally fascinating story of the passenger pigeon. So here you can see where passenger pigeons lived. The eastern United States they were permanent residents, billions of them would move around the eastern United States. And then slowly they just went away. So here's some different accounts that you can read if you like. I like these just because they're kind of dramatic and they kind of give you the idea of how tremendous these birds were. They traveled in huge flocks. Sometimes the flocks would be a mile wide and miles long. This quote says that they continued for 3 days in succession over this town. And it says people were in arms. The banks of the river were crowded with men and boys, incessantly shooting them, and multitudes were destroyed. And for a week or more, the population fed on no flesh other than pigeons and talked of nothing but pigeons. So they would come over in these huge flocks, and people would just shoot them and shoot them and shoot them and shoot them because there were billions of them. And they ate them. They ate many, many of them. But it was also a sport too. So sometimes it was food and sometimes it was just sport. Because there were just so many. And so there's, that feeling of, well, there's so many of these, they're not going to go anywhere. So we can just take all we want, right? They would roost in such great numbers in forests that they would absolutely destroy the forest. So you can see here's a branch just loaded down with passenger pigeons. The branch has fallen off. If you look in the background, pigeons in every tree, pigeons in the sky. So you would have all of these thousands or even maybe millions of pigeons in these flocks that would just absolutely decimate a forest. They would break the branches. Their excrement would be everywhere. They'd eat everything there. So they were just a tremendous thing that I can't even really imagine what it was like to see them. Here's another account from Columbus about a growing cloud that blotted out the sun as it came towards the city, and people ran and they hid and prayed. And the flock took 2 hours to pass, but it did pass. And after it did, the whole entire town was illuminated in pigeon ejecta, so pigeon poop, pigeon droppings. Just crazy to think about, absolutely crazy. So the last passenger pigeon died in 1914 at the Cincinnati Zoo. Her name was Martha. And so passenger pigeons went extinct for a few reasons, because people hunted them incessantly and because there were billions of them. So why would they go away? There's billions of them. But if you do continue to hunt things over and over and over and over, they will go away. The other thing is passenger pigeons, they needed to live in those large groups, and they relied very heavily on nuts that they could find, hickory nuts, beech nuts, acorns, So they needed those things. And as forests disappeared for development and settlement throughout the 1900s or 1800s, their habitat was taken away. So some of it was food and habitat, some of it was the incessant hunting of the pigeons. They also, as I said, they needed to live in big flocks. That's just how they thrived. They roosted in big flocks. They nested, usually in groups. So they were a species very dependent on large numbers. And as their numbers dwindled, they found it harder and harder to survive, and harder to reproduce. So by the end of the 1800s, most of the passenger pigeons out there were privately owned by aviaries and by people, and they tried to breed them. They tried to get them to reproduce, but it was just impossible. The pigeons, because they're so dependent on large numbers, could not reproduce in small numbers. And 1914, the last one died. So a great man named Aldo Leopold, who was a wonderful naturalist in the early part of the 20th century, said, "Men still live who in their youth remember pigeons. Trees still live who in their youth were shaken by a living wind. But a few decades hence only the oldest oaks will remember, and at long last only the hills will know." And that's probably true. I can't imagine that there's anybody alive today that remembers passenger pigeons. Back in 47, when he said this, yeah, there were, but now probably not. I highly doubt it. And it was passenger pigeons were suffering, obviously suffered, and their extinction really woke people up. So in the 1800s, early 1900s, people would take birds and do whatever they wanted with them. There was a huge trade in hunting birds and using them in fashion, particularly hats. There's the hats again. So the men got the beaver hats, the women got these bird hats. So you can look at these hats and see, I mean, there's whole birds on these in some cases, and in some cases just feathers, but people were killing birds in huge numbers. So in 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was passed, and making it unlawful to, hunt, take, kill, capture birds. It doesn't discriminate between live and dead, which is good. So if someone said, well, the bird was already dead, doesn't matter. And bird parts are protected, their eggs, their nests. And there are over 800 species on the list. So this list is still intact. So today, it is technically illegal for people to collect bird parts, to destroy bird eggs or nests, if they're a native migratory bird. If it's a house sparrow or a European starling, it's different because those are not native migratory birds. But any native migratory bird, it actually is illegal to possess any part of that bird or to kill that bird. But we have good news too. So it's not all bad news. One of the best success stories that I'm sure you're probably familiar with, you've probably heard this, is about our bald eagle. It was formerly an endangered species that has now fully recovered, and it's not even listed at all anymore. So back in the early 1900s, eagles were disappearing. People killed eagles for various reasons. A lot of them were because they are scavengers, and they, would come after people's fish and their different animals and things, so that people would just kill them. So there was protection put in place as eagle numbers declined a great deal in the early 1900s. And so in 1967, it was officially declared an endangered species. And that was good because that protected the eagles that were here. And then in 1972 is probably the most important thing for the eagles, which was the outlawing of DDT, which was a pesticide that was used heavily after World War II. So from about, the 1940s until the 70s, to kill insects on crops. So they would spray this stuff everywhere to kill insects. And found over time that it was also affecting our bird population. So DDT was outlawed, and by 1995, they were downgraded on the list from endangered to threatened, and now they're not even threatened, and they are considered recovered. There are breeding pairs of eagles in every state, except for well, probably not Hawaii, but in the lower 48 states, they are plentiful. And there are many, many in Alaska as well. But this is the lower 48 that we're talking about. So let's talk about DDT. DDT was an insecticide, like I said, World War II era. And it was used overseas during World War II in the jungles in the Pacific, and then brought back here to be used because it was effective. And so they would spray it everywhere. And it was found that this DDT was getting into the water, and it was getting into the ground, and it was staying there. So eagles would eat fish from the water, and the fish had DDT in their bodies, and then the eagles would absorb that, and it would stay in their body tissue. This was also happening to other raptors, so eagles weren't the only one. Since they're our national symbol, they are sort of, the poster child for this, but red-tailed hawks, peregrine falcons, all the raptors, the owls, they were all suffering from this problem. And the problem was that once the DDT got into the bird's tissue, it would make the bird either sterile, or it would make the bird's eggs so thin and flimsy that they would never hatch, because they were always going to break prior to hatching. So you can see these eggshells, they're just, once the bird sits on them, they just break apart. So what was happening was no new birds were able to be produced because raptor eggs were so thin and brittle. And so all of our raptors began to disappear once DDT began to be used. In 1979, Ohio had only 4 bald eagle nests that were known. So this is when I was a kid. We never saw bald eagles, ever. I don't know. I didn't see one until I was an adult. And today, last year, bald eagle nests in Ohio, 707 nests. So by outlawing DDT in 1972, has allowed this recovery of bald eagles that has just been tremendous. And so today you can see here how many nests are in each of the counties. Almost every county in Ohio has at least one. You can see we have 3 here in Cuyahoga County that are known. There's the one here at Rocky River. There's one at Ohio Erie Canal Reservation along the Cuyahoga, and then there's one in the National Park in Brecksville. So those are our 3 Cuyahoga nests, and I have little doubt that there will be more nests coming through the years. So if you want to see bald eagles, your best bet is to head west along the lake shore. You can see there's lots and lots of them out that way. And there are other species too who have had varying degrees of success with their comebacks. Snowshoe hares once were here in Ohio pre-settlement, but snowshoe hares have very specific habitat needs, and it's been very, very difficult for them, especially as the climate gets warmer. They need really cold areas. They do well way up north where it's really cold. So they were extirpated, and in the 50s, they started to try to reintroduce them, and they did that over the years for about 50 years, but they just have not really taken hold. They're not particularly successful. So they are a protected species, pretty rare. If you see one in Ohio, you're very, very fortunate. But a really successful one has been the river otter. It was extirpated, and in the 1980s was reintroduced for the first time up in the Grand River, up in Lake Ashtabula, Geauga County. And now we have little pockets of them in various places around our state. And you can see that I think most counties have had at least some sort of sighting of river otters. And so they're really making a comeback. And if you go down to the Cauga Valley National Park, down to the Beaver Marsh, there's a family down there that often puts on shows for people, and people see pretty regularly. So if you were ever curious about a river otter, that would be a great place to try to visit, the Beaver Marsh down in the national park, and see if you can find them. And another one is sandhill cranes. The picture there I took in about a year and a half ago out at Sandy Ridge Reservation in Lorain County. They have a resident pair there, and it has not produced any chicks yet, but maybe hopefully someday it will. By the 1920s, sandhill cranes were no longer found in Ohio, and they were brought back in the 80s. And they're still threatened, but we do have 50 to 60 breeding pairs, and hopefully more will breed or arrive here and be able to breed over time. But if you want to see sandhill cranes, Sandy Ridge in Lorain County, it's a Lorain County Metro Park, is a great place to go. I was just there yesterday and I saw them. So yeah, you can find those out in that direction. A couple other ones, osprey had no nests in Ohio, 1941 to 95. So they were a victim also of the DDT. So they were highly affected by DDT, and they were reintroduced and have come back and have numerous nesting pairs, and they're doing very, very well here in Ohio. So osprey you can find in various places where there's water nearby. There's a lot of places will put up a platform or something for them to actually nest on. But sometimes on cell towers they like to nest, or on billboards. So there are osprey nests around the state. So osprey are doing much, much better. And trumpeter swans, they're still a threatened species, but we do have breeding pairs throughout Ohio. And this is another one, if you go out to Sandy Ridge Reservation in Lorain County, they have resident trumpeter swans. Just saw them yesterday. And they do produce young. So each year they do have some babies called cygnets. And there are several that, I think they had 7 last year. So they are pre-producing and doing well. So this was a species that would have been, people would have just hunted these like crazy for their feathers, to make the hats and things like that. So they struggled a long time, but it's getting better for them here in Ohio. So, my final slide here is, one of my favorite things, which is the Lorax. And unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. So luckily people have begun to care, and so we now have a lot of these animals coming back. And so it's because of that they're coming back, because somebody made a decision to care. So I would love to know